Welcome to The Authority File, the academic library podcast from Choice. This episode is made possible with help from Rowman and Littlefield. I'm Bill Mickey, the host of the podcast and editorial director for Choice, and we're very pleased to welcome Joe Janes to the program. Joe is the author of a book recently published by Rowman and Littlefield called Documents That Change the Way We Live. It's a fascinating book that examines documents and other information objects from thousands of years ago all the way up to today. Joe's descriptions of these items weave in historical and archival context, but always focus on their informational value, especially how a document's particular definition changes over time, how a ballot or a birth certificate goes from a mundane formality to something that changes the course of history, for example. When he's not busy writing books, Joe is an associate professor at the University of Washington Information School. He is a frequent speaker, and he has authored several books on librarianship and technology, and he is the creator and host of Documents That Change the World, a popular podcast series that he based his latest book on. In this final episode of our four-part series with Joe, we talk about the AIDS Quilt. While not technically a document as we might think of one, the quilt nevertheless preserves an important part of cultural history in America. Joe will discuss that dynamic and how many of the documents and objects in his book take on lives of their own, adding new layers of cultural significance over generations. All right, so let's move on to the AIDS Quilt. And why don't you just start by giving us a brief history of the quilt's creation?
The AIDS Quilt is now 30 years old, more or less. The early days of the AIDS epidemic, people really didn't know what it was. Right. People didn't, people were dying of strange cancers and diseases, and it was, there was something going on, but people didn't know what it was, and it was hitting marginalized populations, and therefore it was scary, and how did you catch it, and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. But as more and more people were dying, particularly in large urban centers, and particularly in San Francisco, memorials started, and there was a memorial in 1985, Candlelight Vigil, that was honoring Harvey Milk and George Moscone in 1985, and AIDS victims were memorialized by people holding placards with their names on them, with the names of the people who had died. And at the end of the march, the placards were posted on a wall, and it made people think of a quilt, mm-hmm. of a patchwork quilt, and in particular Cleve Jones, who had been an activist and an assistant to Harvey Milk and so on, made the first panel for his friend Marvin Feldman in 1986, and then more people and more people and more people. By June of 87, there's a collection of several dozen panels in front of the City Hall in San Francisco, and then it continued to grow and grow. And by the fall of 87, so this all happens in a very short amount of time, 2,000 panels are displayed on the National Mall. And it's quite a picture. 2,000 panels on the National Mall in Washington. And this is still the end of the Reagan administration, and he had great difficulty even saying the word. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that it happened as quickly as it did, and that so many panels were made as quickly as they were, so many were made, is an indication that idea had great power. And then it has continued to grow, sadly, ever since.
Right. And we talked about this in the first episode, but I mean, the quilt, obviously it stretches the term document, in which, you're meaning many different kinds of objects, and this is certainly one of those. Can you explain why the quilt works so well as a document, quote unquote, and fits so well in your compilation, in your book?
Well, I picked it for a couple of reasons. First of all, my mother was a quilter, and so I have several of her quilts, and they all mean something to me. I remember her making them. She made some of them for me specifically. They're not necessarily representative, but they're all, they're symbols of my love and affection and remembrance of my mother and my family. It's intriguing because it's not a list. Right. Because I put the chapters in chronological order, it sits next to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in the book, because it was within a few years of each other. It actually came a few years after the Vietnam Memorial. The Vietnam Memorial is a list. It's a chronological list of everybody who was killed in action during the Vietnam War. The 9/11 Memorial is a list. The AIDS Quilt is not, because it's not any particular order. And so it has power both on the individual and on the collective level. Each individual panel memorializes a particular person.
Right.
In whatever way the designer and creator of the panel wanted to. And so each individual one, there's a person, and it documents that person's life and memory, and in many cases birth and death dates and what they did and who they were and all the rest of it. And then you put them all together, which you probably can't do anymore because there's too many of them. But collectively, it is a memorialization of the whole experience. Of the disease, of its discovery, of its treatment, of the fear around it, of the now sort of blasé attitude about it.
Sure.
For many people in this part of the 21st century, it's a nuisance. It's still a serious disease, and it's still chronic, and it still can be fatal. But there's a much more relaxed kind of, particularly among younger people who didn't live through the years of the plague.
Yeah.
As some of us did. So it stands for all of those things, individually and collectively.
Our guest this week, Joe Janes, appears courtesy of Rowman and Littlefield. Documents are milestones and markers of human activity, part of who and what we are. Our story can be told through the objects, profound and trivial, famous and forgotten, by which we remember and are remembered. Jane's new book, Documents That Change the Way We Live, examines dozens of compelling stories that describe these documents, focusing on their creation, motivation, influence, context, and their connections to contemporary life. Documents That Change the Way We Live, and even more books about books, are available from Rowman and Littlefield. If you're purchasing the book from Rowman.com, that's ROWMAN.com, use the promo code Joe Janes, all one word, that's JOEJANES, to save 30% off the cover price. You talk about how an organization was eventually formed around the quilt, obviously to help manage its growth. And it grew so much that the foundation had to develop new ways to document and archive the panels, and the growing collection of supporting materials. And I suppose this sort of plays into the library nerd in all of us, but the importance of the importance of metadata to help organize this growing list of physical stuff. So I guess the quilt itself is almost a meta document. It's a document in itself, but it's also, there's so much that's gone into sort of tracking its sort of outgrowth and what it represents, and it's a sort of growing list of physical things in addition to the symbolism that it represents.
It is. It's unintended consequences. It begins, people just do it. And you could substitute lots of nouns for this, but people just do it. And at the very beginning, nobody is giving the remotest thought to questions of preservation or description or organization. They're mad, and they're sad, and they're grieving, and they're fighting, and they don't know exactly
it's a very emotional thing
fighting against. There's an incredible amount of emotion involved in this.
Right.
And then at a certain point, it begins, I don't want to say it takes on a life of its own, but it becomes something else. It becomes a collection. It becomes a memorial. It becomes an educational tool. It becomes an activist tool. It becomes lots of other things. And then people probably begin to notice that, because so often it's displayed outside and things are moved and folded and they're fabric and it's every kind of material you can possibly imagine. that some of them are starting to degrade, or they're starting to fray, or they get dirty, or people walk on them, and then I want to find somebody's, and I want to find all the ones that have a particular kind of quilting technique, and all of these issues around information objects that we're used to with things like books and articles and bibliographic materials. From a library perspective, these things are effectively realia, we would call them. Nobody cataloged this stuff. Nobody thought about using materials that would endure. So if you're using lace or rubber, they have very different properties, and how do you store them, and how do you humidify them, and how do you clean them, and all of this. So the organization has to play catch up with oh my gosh, we have to save these things. We have to, and these things, not this thing, because it's not a thing, it's things. Right. But it is also a thing, and that gets, for the cataloging nerds out there, it raises the question of what is a work. Mm-hmm. Is it a collective work? Is it a set of individual works? Yes. Right. Is it like an anthology, but it's real and it moves and it doesn't matter what order you put stuff in? So it has all kinds of fascinating properties from an information perspective, not to mention its historical and social and cultural aspects as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this leads to an interesting point you make in this entry about the quilt, and that is that all of the documents in your list are living, I suppose, and that their significance can take on new meanings as time passes. This is especially true of the quilt in even more ways. And you speculate that it may never be finished, sadly, but and it does have a multifaceted structure that works no matter how you assemble it, and that it probably can't be fully assembled at this point anyway. And that, as you say, it functions more as a collection than a single item. And it seems like all of these qualities kind of help make it, as a quote unquote document, even more effective.
Well, it's so big now. I think it's over 1 million square feet. It's very close to 50,000 panels now, each about the size of a grave, and that's intentional. Mm-hmm. It's so big it could never be assembled. I don't think there's a space big enough for it. And so it's usually sent out in pieces, and you can request a chunk to come for an event or a display or this sort of thing. Right. So it does, the fact that it will likely never be intact again, and there's no inherent right way to put it together. You could do it chronologically by when they wthat kind of misses the point, I think, in a lot of ways.
Right.
Any document is a space-time object, and so the Rosetta Stone is degrading in very small ways. Pieces of film are degrading. Paper is degrading or changing its composition. Same thing could be said of the panels of the quilt. So, in that respect, every document is a living document, not only, but also not only in its physical form, but in its perception. So the way as I say, the attitudes about HIV and AIDS are very different now than they were 20 years ago, and very different than they were 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole lot less fear. There's a whole lot less stigma. There's a whole lot less concern, which is bad.
Right.
Somewhat good, mostly bad. The Names Project quilt, therefore, has a different interpretation now than it would have in the very heat of the moment when it was being developed, or the sort of peak of interest in it in the 90s. People perceive it a little bit differently. Not to mention it is a different object because it continues to be added to. The individual panels are changing, mm-hmm. In some cases not for the better. So there's a encapsulated story there about not only the physical journey that these things take, but also the kind of social and cultural journey they take.
Right. But, I guess in the end, the quilt still has a powerfully simple message. Can you remind us perhaps what that is?
The organization that was formed to sort of manage and preserve is called the Names Project. And I think that tells you about what you need to know, that these are lives, all lives are worth remembering. And information objects, documents in general, are how we remember things we weren't there to witness. And when we are gone, individually and collectively, the only thing that remains of us is memories we leave behind in people who knew us, and these traces. So the things we write, the things we draw, the things we sew, the things we create, that's what these things are. Is they are a collective record. They are a collective memory, all the way back to the Exaltation of Inanna 4,000 years ago, written by a woman, we know her name in Hedjuana because she used her name in writing it. And that's how she's the first known author. Right. All the way through an email I sent this morning, and whatever email I'll do tonight. There are lots of people represented in the quilt whose names would have faded much more quickly had it not been for that memorial. You could say the same thing for the Vietnam Memorial and the 9/11 Memorial and a whole bunch of other things. But these things matter. These things are worth remembering, and that's part of what it means to be human. Is to leave records of ourselves so that we can be remembered and understood.
Okay. Well, Joe Janes, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This has been great fun.
You just heard from Joe Janes, Associate Professor at the University of Washington Information School and author of Documents That Changed the Way We Live. Joe is a frequent speaker, and he has authored several books on librarianship and technology, and he is the creator and host of Documents That Changed the World, a popular podcast series that he based his latest book on. This concludes our 4-part series discussing Joe's excellent book, Documents That Changed the Way We Live. This episode was brought to you by Rowman and Littlefield and Choice. You can search for and listen to all of the episodes of the Authority File podcast on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher, or find us on the Choice website at choice360.org. Just click on the librarianship dropdown. If you do listen to us on iTunes or Stitcher, be sure to give us a review. We hope you like what you hear. In the meantime, you can find out more about Choice Reviews and get updates on the latest podcast episodes on the Choice Reviews Facebook page or on Twitter at @choice_reviews. Search for or comment on the podcast using #TheAuthorityFile. Thanks for joining us.